No, no, I think it's a girl down the bottom. It was Joe. Pretty sure.
Yeah. Okay. Kia ora koutou. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Service Delivery Committee meeting for Tuesday, 19th of November. We might be breaking the meeting as we speak. Great to have you here, and I'd like to invite Hinerangi Kara if she could open up with a karakia for us.
Morena kia tātou. Tuatahi kei te tuku atu ngā whakaaro ki te iwi e takataka hinei te whenua I te whanganui a tāra I tēnei rā. E te atua tau mai tō koroa I manaaki me te aroha ki runga I tō tātou ariki I tēnei rā hoki. Toitu te tiriti ki te rangi, toitu te tiriti ki te whenua. Tu taua mai I runga, tu taua mai I raro, tu taua mai I roto, tu taua mai I waho. Kia tau ai te Māori tū, te Māori ora, mo te kingitanga, mo te ao katoa, haumi e hui e, tae ki e.
Thank you. Now, I understand we have a full house, so there's no need for apologies. Are there any disclosures of members' interests? Excellent. Any late items? No. Okay, so could we have the order of the meeting confirmed, please? Thank you, Susan, and thank you, Darren Marie. All in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Thank you. And welcome, Roger, online. I should have
Thank you. That's all right. Thank you.
Okay, and now the first item on the agenda is confirmation of the minutes of our previous meeting. They've been pre-circulated, and I'm happy to move from the chair that they be a true and correct record. And Lou Brown's going to second. All in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Carried. And then our first substantive item, which is the Rotary Christmas Parade Te Awamutu request for temporary road closure. I invite Brian, great to have you here today. And I'll hand over to you to handle this and the next item, I guess.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So these are our two Christmas parades, and so very standard, this following the same format this year as last year in both Te Awamutu and Cambridge, the same streets, the same times, and council has traffic management organised for that, and all the public notices have been made, so in your hands.
Okay, all right. And so I have a mover with Susan and a seconder with Mike. All in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Carried. Thank you. And then the next item, which is the New World Cambridge Christmas Parade.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. So exactly the same situation for the Cambridge.
Okay, no discussion. So Mike's going to second and Marcus is, move, and then Marcus is going to second. Stop delaying things. All in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Carried. And that brings us to the end of our full agenda today. And I'd just like to invite Hinarangi Kara to close with a karakia, please. Or Dale Marie.
Hey, because you know we're into sharing around here, eh? Yeah, well, ko taku korowai tēnei. So, ko mutu o mātou mahi mō tēnei wā, manakitia mai o tātou whānau, kei pōneke, kei konei, i ngā wā katoa, o mātou hua, o mātou whānau, ai o ki te ai o rangi, tūturu whakamaua kia tīna, tīna, haumie, huie, tāhiki, tēnā tātou.
Yeah, just noting it's 13 minutes past 9. Thank you. Appreciate that. Now, look, we're going to have a bit of a break before we can start our workshops, okay, because they can't start until 10 o'clock because of, yeah. I couldn't agree more with you, Philip. Yeah. So, and I understand Mayor Susan's going to chair the workshops as well. Yeah, because that's the local water done well. Yes, Philip.
Nothing to do with the meeting at all.
We're on the live stream.
Yeah. Although we're still live streaming.
If I better word it the right way, I've got a home kill.
Great stuff. If I wish I had a teenager here, they could sort out my. Great stuff. Look, good morning, everybody. Morena. Welcome to our workshop this afternoon, morning rather, on local water done well, an issue or a topic that has been rolling around for some time now, and really excited to be able to have this paper before us and a workshop to go through it, obviously with our friends Rebecca and Martin Jenkins here, but I will hand over to Steph to introduce you both. Lovely to see you all here this morning. Pass the speaking paddle over.
Thanks, me Susan. Atamaria koutou. Nice to see you all. Good morning. And nice to see some members back in the chamber who've been away doing other things. So nice to see you all. And online, want to welcome Councillor Roger and also Campbell from MAFIC, who's been doing the financials for us. And welcome to the people who are online watching this. It's my pleasure to introduce Sarah Badley from Martin Jenkins and Lorraine Kendricks, who's well known to you all, but Lorraine comes to us with her Becca hat on today. So as we all know, I guess we've all been expecting to get to this point in terms of the decision around what we're going to do with Waters Done Well. And you'll all know that through the project team, a lot of work's been going on in the background, running multiple streams of work. Not least of all, I just want to acknowledge Dawn, because BAU continues and the water is still running through taps and out of toilets across the district. But while we consider all of our options as required under the Waters Done Well legislation, and there are still some decisions and some guidance that we're waiting for in terms of the third piece of legislation that's yet to drop, and that's going to provide some even more sunlight onto how the future should look and what direction the government's going to provide for us. So I understand and I empathise with elected members that there's still a lot of questions to be asked, and perhaps we are walking along a pathway of making decisions with what we know at the time we know, knowing that it's not perfect and won't be perfect for some time to come, but we still need to keep along a direction of travel. That's important. We keep still making decisions on, because the water services plan is due in September next year. And obviously the decision about where our Three Waters lands is one of the most critical decisions that this council will make, and probably decades to come. So we need to keep the process ticking along and making decisions. And I just want to thank Martin Jenkins and Becca and MAFIC for the work that has been done for us, and really look forward to the conversations today and obviously tomorrow as well, in terms of the workshop tomorrow afternoon. So Sarah and Lorraine, welcome to the chamber. And unless Dawn's got something to add to that, we will happily be in your hands for the rest of the morning, and thank you for being here.
I'm just going to say I need to introduce myself. Hello, lovely to meet you again, and lovely to be part of this discussion with you. As we've had this discussion for many time, and certainly from a community member, I think it would be great to kind of get some direction. But yeah, probably caveat what Steph said. Bill 3 is yet to come. It should be coming out shortly. We're all kind of waiting in anticipation for it. But ultimately, that will give us more direction, but that still has to go through a select committee process and then won't be enacted until mid next year. At that point, you will be well underway and have made some key decisions already on your water service delivery plan. So yeah, interesting times. We have a slide. Oh, perfect. Okay, so we're going to do a bit of a tag team. Sarah's going to take us through the introduction. We're not going to spend a lot of time on the technical input. So the main report has a lot of data in regard to asset management and where you are sitting in compliance. We have summarized this just to try and keep it focused. The focus for today is really on the key takeouts of financials and the modelling that Campbell has done, as well as taking you through the assessment for the service delivery options. You can read the asset management and the technical stuff at your leisure. There's a couple of slides that I will cover, but all in all, you're actually probably sitting in a good place. So on that basis, I'm going to hand it over to Sarah. We'll kind of take you through the strategic context. I say we'll give you a quick overview on your services. You're in a good place. And then we'll take you through the assessment framework that we've done. We'll do the analysis against the framework. And then it would be good to have a good focused discussion on the service delivery options, and then we'll kind of close it out. Do you want to take questions as we work our way through? I think that would be the best because there's quite a lot of content, and we have just summarized this into some high level slides. So we're quite conscious that there's a lot of detail in the report. Sharon's going to run a parking lot, so we may not address every question today, but that's okay. We'll make sure that we capture it, and then we'll kind of follow through either just we're quite conscious of the time frame and the content that we need to get through. So, and if we're all right with that process, I'm going to hand it over to Sarah and we'll work our way through.
Ngā mihi nui, Lorraine, and kia ora koutou, nice to meet you all. As introduced, my name is Sarah Baddeley. I am a partner at Martin Jenkins. We are a consultancy company that specialises in infrastructure and water-related issues and the public policy and changing regulatory environment for those issues. Online, you also have Campbell Will from MAFIC. They are a specialist financing and infrastructure financial structuring company, in our view, the best in business. So Campbell will come on and, as Lorraine said, lead you through those bits. Most importantly, of course, I am a recovering economist and wearing it on my sleeve, a kid from Raglan. So if you'd like in the tea break to understand how a kid from Raglan becomes a Treasury economist and then moves on to be involved in leading a management consulting company, I can take those questions in the tea break, but it's an interesting journey. And so it is lovely to be back in the hood-ish. I would like to reflect on some very competitive basketball games. Looking around this room, some of you may have been in the team, but Raglan Area School had a formidable reputation on the basketball court, once defeating Church College, and I know you all know what that means. It is fair to say that we did have some ring-ins that day. So thank you. Obviously, that credentialises me well to support you in the discussion today. So you've got some big choices ahead of you. And, you know, the key change from the previous government's Three Waters reform to this one is those choices do sit with you. And so I know your staff, but also the team from Becca and MAFIC see it as our job to support you to be the best informed you can be around those choices. So that's what we hope to lead you through today. Now, it is fearsomely technical in detail, and I'm sure that you range in background and specialty knowledge, level of detail and interest, but you're all passionate about your community. So we will do our best to answer questions as we go from a pretty multidisciplinary perspective. If I start to speak corporate economic gobbledygook, just put your hand up and please stop. My job is to really try and navigate this through for you in a plain English way. So that's kind of our focus in supporting you today. We will take breaks. There's dividers between each of the sections, and we have been supporting a number of councils in this decision. And so from that experience, we know, you know, which issues are concerning many and which issues are bespoke to the particular circumstances. And in summary, you guys are in pretty good shape, you know, your assets are in reasonable nick, and you don't have the kind of very obvious choice or stark choice that is available or required by some councils. That almost makes your job harder because you need to extend beyond a current crisis, which you don't have, into the strategic time frame and strategic decision making. So I just wanted to open up with that kind of comment, and then we can come back to that through it. But it's a credit to obviously previous decision makers and officers that you're in that position. But as we go forward, that's the key. So that's what I'll probably, and I probably will be a little bit challenging for you. But I think that's also what you need from me, because I won't be anywhere near as challenging as your communities will be, as you well know. So let's look at ourselves as comrades in arms in that regard. So in terms of your strategic context, if everyone's comfortable, and Mayor Susan, I won't say through you because I understand you don't like that, we'll crack on. So when we come to support councils to look at their the state of their water service delivery, we obviously want to start in the strategic context. That is largely because the decisions you're making today are around assets that have 30 to 50 and even longer if you can sweat them economic life. So you really do need to be strategic. But your world for your strategic context is changing, and the key elements of the government's local water done well policy changes and legislative changes are set out and were set out in your background reading pack. The main thing is, as Lorraine has said, is the production of this water services plan, which you have to do by next year. But the really big change is the need for you to be able to assess and look at your water asset quality and financial information in a completely different way than you have had before. Now, you're in quite good position because you have been what we call financially ring fencing to an extent. You've been looking at the numbers and your finances to do with water differently. A lot of councils have them fully integrated and it's a very murky picture. So you're well positioned, but it's also going to be different in terms of how you report, the standalone requirements for water, when it comes to how you're financing it and the operating and revenue costs associated with it. And also the big thing is that the economic regulatory environment is changing. So what do I mean by that? I mean, the government's going to introduce law that requires another party, an economic regulator, to look to make sure that you are charging enough, paying enough, and adequately providing water services into the future for your communities. So the nature of your investment decisions you've been making historically will be quite different going forward. So it is, those are the key elements of local water done well. And it means that when I put up some of the options, just don't compare them to what has been, compare them against what will be. And so when I talk to councils, often people say, how are we going to, how will we know that water services will be at the level that the community wants, and what if it isn't? And the answer to that is there will be much greater requirements in the future about what that is. So there'll be less flexibility for individual councils to determine things like quality and performance standards. So that's probably some of the key elements of local water done well. The government, therefore, has also set out some options, and this slide sort of summarises the core choices that you will and do have available to you. An internal business unit is a option. The single council CCO is another, and those are good options for councils that have a very strong financial capacity and a good confidence that they've got all their key risks and opportunities in check. And then multi-council organisations, and those are the CCOs that will have the benefit of scale, more robust balance sheet capability, and a greater sort of scope of services for communities that come together under those options. Now here, the devil is in the detail, and nerds like me are desperate to get our hands on the detail of that third bill that's being introduced. That is expected in December, because there will be a lot of detail to come on those options. And some of the choices you'll have available, you'll want to wait and see that detail, because across all of these options, you do have choices. So as I said, unlike some councils where the finances are strictly and thoroughly ruling out standalone options, you do have a standalone CCO as what we're calling a kind of a maybe option. And I don't want to spoiler alert on that. We'll get to that in terms of the back end of the presentation.
Just to note that we haven't documented the other options that are in the pack, which was option 4 and option 5, which are the community trusts. We haven't focused on them because at this point in time, the indication is that the LGFA will not fund them. So we've only kind of looked at the areas that will be funded, but just to kind of complete that. But you will see more detail on that potentially in Bill 3, but I haven't heard one council that is anyway interested in option 4 or 5 as yet, but who knows? And see whether that comes through.
There are also some additional requirements that will be set out and have been set out that are close to the heart of local government decision makers, and that's those are summarised here, including some things related to council staff and elected members' representation, and protections against privatisation, and the fact that these entities will only be able to provide water services. That's quite an important one when you're looking at CCO options. The theory behind that is that, and in my experience now, I have worked in regulated energy companies, so very similar to water in both New Zealand and Australia. And one thing about utility businesses is they do often get bored with their core business, and they do start to go into other areas of service provision. And so that is designed to keep them focused on the task and get the board and management focused on the task. There is, as we all know, a lot to do in water, so that's a good requirement to see there. This is just a high-level view of the legislative timeframe, and we can come back to that because I don't plan to dwell on that in any detail, except to say that that third bill is going to be quite interesting for the mechanics of how these options work. But more importantly, if I step back, and this is kind of what you need, I think, from people like me, I step back and I look at you serving your Waipa community, and I think about the strategic timeframe. And this is separate from consideration of water, but just your general strategic issues. And your council officers have also been really useful in helping frame that, and I can see you've done some good work yourselves on that. But I look at you as a high growth council with shifting demographics and quite rapidly growing, increasingly urbanised, which is, compared to when I was driving through these streets, I'm approaching 50 next year with my mean game of basketball. Your area is materially different than it was way back then, and that is set to go and continue. You also have relatively strong economic performance, and that's a relative judgment. Obviously, lots of people in your communities are hurting at the moment, but you're quite well diversified, and you don't have a dependence. You're not worried about hollowing out of your region, which a lot of district councils are. And that means that you need to keep your options flexible and pointed towards supporting growth. That means you can probably go into these decisions with a degree of confidence that might not exist in other parts of the country. And the other thing that is distinct for your area is that you do have treaty settlement obligations. I mean, all parts of the country have treaty settlement obligations, but you have particular treaty settlement obligations related to natural resource settlements that are actually quite different from other parts of the country. And that is your responsibilities under Te Turu Whaimana predominantly. And that will mean that those are enduring and will likely, in a strategic sense, change the course of your relationship to accessing water as you go into reconsenting processes. Now, your consents are relatively well secured, but the likely direction of travel in terms of the expectation of mana whenua in the area is a higher degree of specificity on treating the water and the waterways and water bodies with care than lower. So that means that I look at you and I see growth, good solid basis for being confident about it, but knowing that your consenting or regulatory expectations are likely to be quite tight. The rules are changing in economic, water quality, water standards, but also your treaty partners are likely to have pretty high expectations of you going forward. So that's kind of your strategic context that we see. Now, that's a pause point for me, Mayor Susan. I do also apologise. I could take you for the next 7 hours without taking a breath on this topic. So you have to keep me on check. So very happy to take questions on the strategic context for either Lorraine Campbell or myself.
Cheers. Thank you, Sarah. Any questions for these two fine people? Claire?
Yeah, thanks. Really good that we're going to dig a bit more into the strategic context, because I do feel that's really important. So with the shifting demographics, I mean, you highlight the impact of those fast track consortia. because I think that's going to be really relevant for us if we're looking at determining, you know, a strategic, I suppose, configuration, on that. And it's all, for me personally, it's not just enough to list it. I'd really like to do a bit of work on it and to understand it in more detail, because I think that's going to be really relevant to our decision. And also under point 2, which is the, our economic performance. One thing that we learnt from Infometrics when we were doing some of our growth strategy work was that industrial nodes really drive employment growth. Actually, it was in the Ahuaki thing, I think. Yeah, and I thought that was a really important takeaway. And we have released some new industrial land, you know, at Hautapu, and also the airport will be another key driver. But we also know that we're constrained by our water takes, and I think that we need to have a really clear view of what we want to, where we want to go in terms of that economic performance before we start negotiating with possible partners. You know, like we've got to, because if we don't understand that, we can't negotiate for those outcomes. Okay. So I'm just signaling that that's some more stuff I think that it'd be good to have some discussion around in terms of, strategic context. Yep. Thank you.
Thanks, Claire. Lorraine.
So Claire, probably just to pick that up, is just getting some more definition or clarification around that 30-year horizon. So that's kind of your infrastructure strategy. And look, to be fair, it's quite hard for the waters team to kind of forecast a lot of that at the moment and with the growth. So it's trying to be certain, but with a bit of flexibility, particularly around time. In regard to the water take, so we've got Te Mata Arawai at the moment are looking at the wastewater standards. So they really are not giving a whole lot of overview in regard to the regional consenting around your stormwater or your water take aspect yet. They've been quite silent on that. And so that's going to be a watch and see. So at the moment, the water takes are still sitting under the RMA remit. How that's going to change, not sure. They have signalled that the NPS, the National Policy Statement for Freshwater Management, which is where you get all of your water takes in this district, is subject to change. So I think that will drive. And certainly the indications are they are kind of putting that more cost factor in that probably wasn't there in regard to the proportionate. So it's going to be interesting to see what that balance will be in regard to quality versus the cost versus the social dynamics. So unfortunately that's all silent at the moment. So it'll be interesting to see how that pans out in the next year or so.
Thanks. Any other questions for these two before they move on? I had to chuckle when I read North Waipa. That's what I jokingly refer to the city as. But anyway, there you go. Oh, Philip.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Susan. Thank you for today. You started off to say that we're on the whole we're in reasonable shape, with our infrastructure and what have you. There was a couple of us at a regional zone meeting last week with all our other fellow councillors around region and mayors and things like that, and DIA were there doing a presentation, and they said that as a group of people, we're actually working really well together compared to other councils. Were they just sweet talking us, or what's your view on that? What's the feedback that you've had from around the country, from other regions, and everyone working well together? Are we, or are we not?
Yeah, no, I think you are. I always laugh in this area, and Steph might smile because she heard me say this before. When it comes to water service delivery, everyone thinks that this is an excellent reform for their neighbour. There's a natural bias towards thinking that your own assets are in good nick and that everyone else needs to change. And I think in the Waikato, what you've seen is a realisation that that's not the case. You've all got You've all got issues, but they're slightly different. Your issues are predominantly around growth and making sure that you have sufficient forward investment to make sure that that growth is the best it can be, that you can support a diversified industrial mix in terms of employment and growth, and that you have that urban community will come to you with expectations that are quite different from the communities that have been. So I can say that coming from Raglan and now living in Auckland, my Raglan standards are somewhat lower than my NIMBY neighbours. And that says something about me more than my neighbours. So that's the issue. So you're having a good conversation. There's been a degree of insight that you've all got issues, but they're slightly different. There are some councils that are, well ahead with the conversations with their council laws, so they're closer to a decision. But a good conversation with yourselves is important, but it's really how you take it forward. And if you do need to partner to deliver that value to your communities in a long-term sense, how you talk with others. So that's what I would observe. So I don't think they were completely talking your book. I think there's some merit there.
It was a wet day, so they're probably trying to cheer us up a bit. But and you talk about growth, but and we all acknowledge that huge amount of growth in the area. A way of helping fund this is increasing development contributions, and with the market the way it is, we're struggling to get a lot of that back now. So how's that going to go down with developers and things like that, to pay for this?
And I think that's probably key, from your community engagement and key consultation, you'll have some key stakeholders, your developers will probably be one of them that you may want to have those kind of early conversations with as you kind of work your way through. But we kind of have factored in some of the DC components into this, so Campbell can certainly talk to that. But like we do kind of recognise that you are probably not receiving the DCs that you had planned to receive in the time that you wanted to receive them, and that has a knock-on impact. So it's just then the good thing is you're aware of that, and then it's trying to get a strategy to kind of address that as you move forward. So
there's going to be some big increases in costs for everyone, ratepayers and everybody.
Yeah.
I mean, I think this reform is not going to seek a reduction in costs, and some of the discussions that we've had with the Commerce Commission, normally an economic regulator comes in to protect the consumer to bring charges down. They've said that they're going to find themselves in a very unique and interesting situation of signalling that actually costs have to go up. And that's an unusual place for an economic regulator to find themselves in, but that is the state of play across the nation. In regard to the other comment, I think there's a lot of disparity where every council are. Some are talking to neighbours, some are not talking to neighbours, some are working together, and some are not. So it's really a mixed bag across the country at the moment.
Cool. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Cheers, Flip. Lou, did you have something you wanted to ask?
Yeah, I just want to make one quiet comment. We look back at your presentation to date and have a look at financial sustainability. One of the key problems we have is when we're looking at regulatory compliances, this government and the last government particularly increased the regulatory compliances quite dramatically. Now, we're dealing here with infrastructure that has up to 30 years of life. We can't just go out and switch things on and switch things off. We can't just put money aside in case they need to have an agreement with all of these CCOs or whatever we have, that they will preclude or give us information well in advance of asking that legislation to be implemented. Because we need to be able to cope with that. We can't just turn something on and turn something off, and it'll reaffect. So when we talk of that financial sustainability, I think that's one thing that the government itself, and has to go back to central government, has to be aware that we can comply to a level, but we cannot keep changing those levels. We've got to keep them fairly consistent because of the length of life of all of our infrastructure. And I think that's something that has to be in the back of my mind, concerns me more than anything, is that we have seen over this last 5-6 years regulations put in with little regard to what it is actually asking. It has been implemented, but they haven't actually looked. We are putting up a wastewater plant in Cambridge right now, but what are we actually having to actually comply with? And there's no actual set standard. We're doing, well, equal to what one of the other plants are, but we have to have these things set, because I think that's another critical thing to look at.
Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt that councils across the board, not just in the water area, have faced a number of regulatory changes and unfunded mandates that have transmitted through. I know that's something that you're also discussing to get collectively at a national level. I suppose for me and for you, my advice to you is strategy is the art of decision making and uncertainty. And so I'm here saying to you, I think that the regulatory risk is northward, you know, that it's going to increase. So you need to make decisions based on the kind of a view that it is likely that there will be a continued period of regulatory uncertainty, but when those regulations do become clear, they will be tighter rather than looser. So you're not going to go backward to a period where you could easily get access to permissions for wastewater treatment, stormwater treatment, and access to water. So that's my response. Very well made comments, but that strategy is the art of decision making and uncertainty. So if you're comfortable, we'll move on and we can talk about the specific issues.
Sarah, just before you do that, can I just ask perhaps that there's the nexus of the relationships going forward will be between the regional council as the environmental regulator, Taumata Arawai as the water standards regulator, and ComCom as the financial or economic regulator. And so when we're talking about an environment that will be something that we've never had before, that's the nexus, that whatever entity will be at play will be responsible for reporting to, being compliant with all three of those regulatory bodies. And so, Lou, to your point, that whatever the CCO looks like will have to ensure that it's compliant with Taumata Arawai, but at the same time, there will be a relationship between Taumata Arawai and the ComCom to make sure that both from a timing perspective, a lead-in perspective, and ability to fund and finance perspective, that there are plans and investment afoot to be able to meet that. And of course, one of the things that I think this government's looking at is what are the national standards that they need to set so that there is that consistency. So yeah, and that's the complexity of the environment we're about to step into, right?
Yeah.
So that's probably a good segue, Steph, in regard to where you are. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide. In short, we talked about you have managed your assets really well. You are fully compliant across the board in regard to your drinking water standards and your regional consents. That query around the connections, Claire. So our numbers represent the 23 existing plus there's a growth vector put on it. So that kind of came from the rate strike. So that's why it looks a wee bit different, but we can come back to you and confirm all of those numbers. So that's why our numbers are slightly higher. Key things to consider, and we've kind of just been talking about that. So I say Taumata Arawai will be your drinking water regulator. So they are the primary regulator in that. They also have an oversight role in regard to stormwater and wastewater. They are currently setting the wastewater standards as we speak. And they will be coming out for consultation in the new year. Those standards are completely different to how you currently have got your consents in the past. So I suppose the one to think of will be your Te Amutu wastewater treatment plant upgrade, which will be coming probably predominantly from a growth perspective in the medium term. So those wastewater standards are into pipe. So basically they will set, it'll be a single standard and the regional councils will be required to comply to that standard. So it'll be very interesting how that goes, completely differently how we have ever consented anything in the past under the RMA, and quite similar to how you would do it actually in the likes of Europe and America, that you have a one single standard end of pipe. If you meet that treatment standard, then it kind of by default nearly turns into controlled activity. So quite different. So watch that space, consultation on that next year. Other thing to factor is, and we have not focused on it today, but just in regard to your strategic thinking, is your 2 water versus 3 waters discussion. So your LTP at the moment is set predominantly looking through a 2 water lens in regard to moving forward. We have looked at this through a 3 water lens. So just to call that out, particularly when we get to the finances. The reason why we've looked at this through a 3 water lens is because that is what is the requirement of the legislation as it stands at this moment in time. Your financial sustainability test is across the 3 waters, not the 2 waters. So that's why our assessment has been based on that. So just careful to call that out. Bill 3 is going to bring in further clarity around stormwater. What we're anticipating coming is that there will be responsibilities further defined between the role of a private owner and the role of council in regard to ownership of the assets, predominantly over overland flow paths and urban water courses. So at this moment in time, nobody really looks after private overland flow paths or have any oversight of it. The likelihood is that this Bill 3 will define some clarity and responsibilities on who does what, and will also give some powers to council to be able to manage on behalf of the wider community and put some responsibilities and emphasis on those private owners to actually address any issues to do with private overland flow paths or urban water courses. And give you some tools. So at this moment in time, your stormwater activity does not include any budget or any allowances for any of these overland flow paths or really any management on urban water courses. You do a little bit in Mangapeco Stream and elsewhere, but on the whole, it's not an activity that you no council has been responsible for. So that's going to come out in Bill 3. The other area that's going to come out in Bill 3 will be the National Engineering Design Standards. So they are going to move ahead with that. That was part of the previous reform. And this government is really keen in regard to standardization, trying to get rationalization of procurement, and then ultimately trying to minimize costs moving forward. Kind of similar response to the national wastewater standards to try and get more efficiencies in the pipeline. So that will be the other thing. So we're just looking to get some clarity on what that means in regard to your current code of practice, which kind of sits and is hooked into your district plan. So they'll give some clarity on how that gets managed moving forward. But that is the intent, that there will be national engineering design standards. At the moment, they're likely just to be on reticulation. They won't drop into reservoirs or treatment plants or anything at this moment in time. But the intention is that that will probably move forward into the future. So just again, put that strategic hat on in regard to how you're currently managing is going to be quite differently to how you will manage moving forward with all those 3 regulators in place and actually the remit of national standards coming in and also the additional responsibilities of stormwater.
Madam Chair,
Claire.
Just on that point, like at the Zone 2 meeting that was on Friday, we had Marlon Brudge, and he talked about the intention to have standardized packages for wastewater treatment plants specifically, actually. Yeah, with the intent that it would streamline processes, give certainty, and hopefully reduce costs.
So we're just about to embark to work with Te Mata Arawai on those standards. So what Te Mata Arawai will provide in regard to the provision of regulations is a set of quality standards. So they're looking at a couple of things. They're looking at the water, and they're going to look at the different receiving environments. So for example, you will have a standard going to freshwater. You'll have a standard going to ocean. You'll have a standard going to land. Standard for biosolids, so it will pick up that sludge-stream. So they're going to provide aspects of standard. They won't go down the line of, and to make this standard, you can buy this package plant off the shelf. They won't go down that. They'll leave that up to the market to decide. But the market will play in that space and play really well. The other area, which is not applicable to Waipa, Te Mata Arawai have just engaged us to do a study on for those ponds that are less than, serve a population of 1,000. And so again, similar, they'll probably have different standards because of the risk associated is minimal, but still trying to protect the environment. And so they may end up in a kind of acceptable solution. So that may have some more standardization in regard to plant and material. And, if you've got that, you can add that on. So that's probably where it's likely to go. Yeah. So, look, you know, all these key risks and challenges, they focus in your annual report and your regular reporting to the Service Delivery Committee. But just to kind of wrap them up, because this ultimately sets the operating context for the assessment. We have already talked about meeting the demands of growth, and we've also got those fast tracking consents that are within your boundary and on your neighbouring council boundaries. We've got constrained investment, and so therefore it's kind of hard to kind of improve those operational efficiencies, particularly in the asset management space. Notwithstanding that you're not doing a good job, it's just hard to kind of keep that momentum up as things kind of keep moving. There are some areas where we need to understand your asset information quality a little bit more, probably more to do so in the water supply area. You have just landed a new stormwater discharge consent. So that has increased your operating costs associated with managing that consent. And I'll just caveat that with the discussion I mentioned earlier in regard to additional responsibilities of stormwater. Look, everyone, and this is kind of standard, the ability to attract and retain key resources, although to be fair, I think you have been doing much better than some of your neighbours in regard to the calibre of staff you have been able to attract and retain in Waipae. In Waipae District Council. But just to be, again, that strategic context, what's happening next door? You know, what's happening up north? Are, you know, in regard to being able to retain those people under longer aspects? Have they got bigger programs next door that you're going to retain that? So at this moment in time, you've done a fantastic job over the years. But again, just that future, keen to keep that future view aspect. You do have that high dependence, probably more so in the water supply in regard to your industrial uses, predominantly Fonterra, no surprise, sitting over 30% of your water take. So that has always been a challenge on whatever happened in regard to their long-term strategy. So making sure you stay close to Fonterra and that you're always a step ahead, making sure that you understand their long-term strategy in regard to both the Te Muru and Hautapu dairy plants is key. And then, as I say, actually a lot of your water assets are due for replacement. So you've kept up really well in regard to your renewals program. There's been a little bit of pullback on it in the first few years of your proposed LTP. Look, you understand that, you know what you're doing, and you look to catch up in later years. So, I mean, the key thing is that you're actively managing that. So no real issues. So I'm going to pass it back to Sarah. We're going to set a context to the assessment, and then that's when we'll start bringing Campbell in to kind of start taking you through that financial modelling. Any queries on your current state?
Mike Pettit has a question for you.
Thanks through the chair. It's really a statement, I guess, of when I looked at all the risks on that last slide there, and there was, you know, obviously those slides, there's a lot of detail in behind them, is that development contribution. You know, we're looking at 5 times what we're currently doing, and that to me is a massive risk that whatever we choose here is what some of the financial analysis has been done on, and that's something that needs to be brought back to this table frequently, often, in depth. Can't be forgotten, because that's a big driver for paying for whatever we come up with.
I think that's an incredibly important point, and maybe when Campbell's talking through your debt position and how credit rating agencies might view your council and the risk and uncertainty at the moment, and how the LGFA in particular will view development contributions, we can have a more discussion around that point, because I think that is a very valid pause point in an area where you should make sure you're always on top of firstly, how the LGFA will be viewing development contributions, and secondly, the confidence with which you can assume that you're going to get those DCs in at a same or better, arguably better rate than you have in the past. And a lot of that is to do with your broader economic environment. As I said, you could be more confident than others, but it's still a relative confidence in the current economic climate, which is, you know, as we know, pretty fragile. So if you're comfortable, sorry, another question?
Councillor Bruce has a question.
Yes, jumping back, Lorraine was talking about asset information requires requires improvement. Do you mean like in our water field, we've got 70% of our pipework network no information, yet we've looked after the big things?
Yeah.
But do we need to improve in that field?
I think the areas to look at are kind of, water supply and water reticulations is hard to do condition assessments on, because actually there's always piping and it's a pressure network. So it's kind of just getting an understanding of, monitoring those failures and kind of doing performance. I think it's, to be fair, there's very few councils that have the maturity, actually, and even Watercare, if you kind of look at that, they're still probably not a mature level of really kind of assessing their assets on more than just based on age. So your water supply assets, that's largely based on the life of them. So that's how we're doing the assessment of the asset condition. Different in your wastewater, because you're able to put a camera down that. So you've pretty much CCTV'd and done a condition assessment on your wastewater. So you know that really well. And stormwater, your assets are actually quite, they're newer, they're younger. So assessment of that. So that's where the water supply is a little bit different. It's harder to do the condition assessment. And so you really kind of need to have that more maturity in your asset management to kind of really then start bringing in that performance assessment to it. But look, at this moment in time, it's not as if you're running around and doing a whole load of bricks, or, so it's signaling that the network is okay, but we've just put it as a thing that you actually probably need to start getting a better understanding of your water supply assets, and probably just your treatment plants would be the other way, kind of starting to kind of get in and really understanding conditions of your reservoirs and conditions of the actual treatment plants as well. So, and those takes and outlet structures.
So facetiously, we're not quite in the state of Wellington City.
Yes, exactly. And you've got a community who tells you really loud and clear if there's a little break on the side of the road, but you just don't have them. But as I said, that's the area that you really are kind of just lacking really analysis to really make informed decisions moving forward. Just something to be aware of.
Lou.
Yeah, thank you very much. Just one of the things interesting. I come from a civil defence background and I work with that area.
Yeah.
We're now including stormwater. Okay, and I did notice that in your trade, council retains responsibility for funding all stormwater. Okay, so we're getting new regulations. So we can't actually ask for that for DCs only. We're going to have a liability because we're going to have to bring that up to a standard that we're going to have to process it so that we can actually have stormwater going out. And unfortunately, stormwater comes from outside our areas, outside our CCOs, outside of all of us. It's going to be a very, very complex problem to try and resolve all of that. And who pays for the bill? Is it the end user that unfortunately has to discharge it into the river, not the building that's 25 kilometres away, or the place that actually some of the detritus comes from? It's just something to have a look at and has to be considered.
And I think the indication from the government, and we're expecting more clarification, is that ultimately, regardless, the three waters will remain council's responsibility. So whether it's an in-house business unit or a CCO, you are still legally responsible for all three waters in regard to whether it's via statement of intent. In regard to stormwater, the direction of travel at the moment from the legislation is that will remain a rate. And the reason why that's going to remain a rate is because of the public benefit aspect of it. It's not something that you can put in a utility bill. The water and the wastewater has the ability to be in a utility bill, and I imagine we may see some direction on that moving forward. So look, yeah, but that's where we're just expecting some clarity from that, but that's the early signals coming through. All three can be a rate, so they can still remain a rate, but you've got the options of utility bills for the wastewater and water supply. And just for benefit, the Watercare, they bill wastewater based on your water usage, and I think it's at the moment it's sitting around about 78% of your water bill then gets translated to a wastewater bill.
I think we can probably move on now.
Right.
Thank you.
I'm just mindful that it looks, have we lost Campbell online? Campbell, are you there? He's still there?
We just can't, we can see
You can't see them.
Yeah,
Excellent.
I am building for setting a fire alarm.
Oh, you've had a fire alarm, have you?
Yeah, I'm just walking upstairs, so I'll join them.
I'll take my time then in providing an overview of the assessment framework. Yeah, okay. So we have looked at your at your financial statements and your, your service performance in the way that the Department of Internal Affairs will likely look at it. So that's why the way we look at it is slightly different from the way you have historically looked at it. And Lorraine has already said to you, we've looked at it from a Three Waters perspective, because that's the way you'll need to look at it in your water services plan as well. So that's kind of the benefit of getting, externals to come in and hold a mirror up to you in a slightly different way than you might have in the past. And we've done that by looking at your operating context, your service levels, your cost drivers, your financial projections, and then analysing them in terms of some key metrics and ratios that are going to be relevant to that overall assessment about whether you're financially viable and sustainable in terms of the provision of services to your communities. So if Campbell hadn't been walking down the stairs in a fire alarm, I would have skipped through this slide, but I am going to give him the benefit of a little bit of time. The operating context is largely what Lorraine has just outlined to you, so I won't dwell on that. In terms of the metrics specifically, they're set out here, and I'll just try and go through them in a little bit more plain English. But it's always a worry when an economist talks about financing or accounting, because we tend to just assume everything's been fine and look into the future a bit more. So that's why we'll get Campbell on the line. So revenue sufficiency is really, is there enough revenue to cover the costs? And in your case, we make some observations around how you're pretty ambitious in terms of your revenue. Your revenue is arguably a little bit more than you might need. So we'll come back to that. Investment sufficiency is the level of investment sufficient to maintain assets, meet regulatory requirements, and provide for growth. Now, this is where your strategic judgment comes in, because while we've looked at your draft LTP, we know that you have some fast track consenting. We know that you have some how do we put it, less economic headwind than the rest of the country. You have probably in your decision making a bias towards growth rather than a concern about contraction. So you need to be really confident that you have enough investment capacity. Financing sufficiency is all about your borrowing capacity and your debt limits. When we look at some key ratios there. Resourcing sufficiency is almost a balance of judgments. It's a judgment about your capacity and your capability to get the work away in terms of your historic pattern of whether you've been able to meet your investments as set out in your infrastructure strategy, to get those DCs in at the rate at which you forecast, and generally your ability to retain and attract talent to get your program of work away well. Affordability is, of course, the most important from your perspective. And, this is so subjective. I don't think anyone facing cost of living pressures like your communities are could make light of this metric at the moment. But what we do for you is we have a bit of a ready reckoner looking at, where we would see your charges going against kind of average assumptions of what would be expected in your kind of area and this kind of infrastructure provision. And you're actually looking okay on that one based on the data we have. The key issue is, have you got enough investment in there to meet your growth into the future? But that's a good place to start. So that's the kind of general framework that we've used and approach we've used in providing our advice. Now, just before I go into the metrics questions, Councillor Claire.
Yeah, so I'd just like to understand the different metrics that you've used, because, one of the big challenges for us is that we seem to be forced into this metric of debt has to be kept within a limit of 5 times the revenue. Yeah, and I'm not sure if anyone's tested whether or not that's a sensible approach for a water business in New Zealand. I understand overseas, for instance, the World Bank, they use a metric that is debt to assets, and another one is, debt to equity, and then whether or not it's the servicing of the debt. So it's the interest component of the debt. For instance, as a growth council, so Waipa's got two different kinds of debt. You know, one of the types of debt is serviced by ratepayers. You know, I guess that's historic debt, and it's to do with assets that are in use in our current networks. And then we've got other assets that aren't in use, the ones we've built or in advance, you know, because we're sort of foreseeing in the future where we might need them in the future like that. Those are our growth assets that can't be repaid from, you know, by rates because they're not in use, but we expect them to be repaid by developers as sections come on the market. But that debt is actually, it has an interest component to it, and the requirement is that those developers meet the interest. So in a way, if you've got a metric that's looking at debt service coverage, where you can take into account the interest that's being met from the developers for the development contribution, like that growth debt, we might find that the constraints that we're labouring under may actually, be drastically reduced or even disappear completely. So I'm really keen to make sure that the metrics that we have are actually fit for purpose and aren't going to drive perverse outcomes. I mean, what I'm really worried about is that because we've got to have this, debt's got to be 5 times the revenue, you know, that's our absolute limit. So let's increase the revenue as much as we can, you know, like that. I'm not happy with that approach because it'll end up where our ratepayers are actually having to pay more for a service simply to comply, you know, with an arbitrary metric, I guess. Yes. So did you consider other metrics, you know, internationally that are applied to water utilities, like the World Bank one?
Yeah, so as I said, our approach here is reflecting what we fully anticipate the government's approach will be, and also how, you know, organisations like your ratings agencies view your financial capacity. I see Campbell and I'm comforted by the fact that Campbell is online, and that is great because Campbell actually is the person who has these discussions with rating agencies in particular, so he can speak to the detail of it. By and large, though, I'll just comment that people view utilities, so, you know, things with certain revenue streams that are regulated through an economic regulatory regime with big long-term asset bases, with more confidence than they do other forms of service delivery. So we are expecting that that people will take comfort from CCO type arrangements where they have one job, which is to deliver water services well, and that is subject to an economic regulator. So that's kind of relevant. This is also one of those areas where you might well have well-founded and well-evidenced opinions to the contrary, but you won't be the one setting the rules. And that's kind of one of those judgments. But I might just leave Campbell to answer that in more detail. So Campbell, did you capture the question, which is just around the debt to revenue ratios and other bases on which to view investment sufficiency?
Yeah, and is the audio coming through okay?
Yeah.
Great, thanks. Apologies for that delay. Yeah, I mean, it's a really valid question and a key point that gets picked up quite a bit here, in that the metrics that are applied for local authorities, but in particular that debt to revenue metric, doesn't accommodate that kind of when things are funded by growth through things such as your development contributions, because both at the rating agency level and at the LGFA level, the capital revenues are excluded. When we look at the water utility, typically we look at, and we've got a slide on it to talk through today, a different ratio. And so it's referred to as the funds from operations to debt ratio. And ignoring all the kind of technicalities of that, the key points are that it does look to include those gross revenues. There just needs to be a little bit of a consideration of what that profile looks like, though. They're yet to kind of test where rating agencies and lenders will take that profile where it is quite different to what's been delivered in the past, but we would expect them to be including at least part of it. But what that means by looking at those different ratios and looking at different bands that those ratios fit within, you generally can leverage up these entities when they're outside of council to a higher level. And that's more appropriate for the type of infrastructure that they're investing, which has a longer life.
Okay, thank you. If you're comfortable, we'll go into the financial metrics themselves. Are you in a good position now, Campbell? I'll move the slides for you. Looks like you might be sitting down in the...
He's outside.
You're outside. Good on you, Campbell. I'm sure the council will acknowledge extenuating circumstances for you. Can you actually see the slides, or are you on your phone?
No, I don't see the slides. Thank you. Just a little bit background there, sorry.
Okay, so we're on the capital expenditure slide.
Yeah, great. And so as sort of talked through there, a section that we're about to go into essentially just overlays that financial sustainability lens and those different financial metrics across your latest forecasts. And the forecast that's been used is the FY25 enhanced annual plan, and then the draft long-term plan as at the end of September. In that long-term plan, we've also added in just recently the updated capital budgets for the Kawamutu wastewater treatment plant and the Cambridge wastewater pipe upgrade, as well as the consequential OpEx associated with that in terms of interest and depreciation. And in the next couple of slides, we'll focus on the Three Waters level, as has been talked to previously, and the residual council. But in this more longer report that's been provided, you'll see we also go into each of the water, wastewater, and stormwater on an individual basis as well. Overall, what you're going to see is that for Three Waters, investment levels appear to be adequate. Forecast revenue is slightly higher than costs, just something to talk to. Debt levels are elevated at this stage, but look to come down quite quickly over the end of the forecast period. And then there's on the affordability metrics side, there's a couple of large increases in revenue over the next couple of years that needs to be considered as well. So we'll look to go into each of those points in a bit more detail over the coming slides. So this first slide is on capital expenditure, which is looking at that investment sufficiency test. So as mentioned before, that is looking at whether the projected level of investment is sufficient to maintain your assets, to meet regulatory requirements, and to provide for growth. At the total level for Three Waters, the plan includes around 500 million of investment over the next 10 years. And that's roughly or slightly below what's been invested in the last 6 years, but relatively close. And that's essentially just reflecting where you're at in terms of your investment profile. The renewals aspect there is another component that will be looked at through this. And that's how does your investment in renewals compare to your depreciation? So essentially, are you looking to renew and replace your existing assets? And then on top of that, you have your levels of service and growth, which is additional. And in the forecast presented on a slide for waters, the investment in that renewals is in excess of your depreciation, which is a good thing. There is a little bit of variation though when you look at the individual assets. So as was talked about earlier, you're currently going under your quite significant renewals investment program for your water assets, and that's at around 180% of depreciation, so much higher. Wastewater's slightly below at around 86%, and stormwater's quite a lot below your renewals level at 24%. But essentially, just coming back to that reflecting your age and stage of your assets and where your investment priorities are at this stage. So overall, aside from the delivery risk point that was discussed earlier as well, we haven't identified any material issues with the capital expenditure program.
Madam Chair, could I ask a
Unless
question?
there's any questions on this, we can jump over here.
Could I just ask a
Campbell, I've
question?
just got one here from Claire St Pierre.
Yeah, about the capital expenditure slide. Yeah, just 2 points. The first one is just to understand it in more depth, actually, where you are using renewals as, I suppose, the comparison for the depreciation expenditure. Would there be any overlap with some of the level of service investment that might qualify as, I suppose, you know, it's renewing an asset, but, you know, so it could use those depreciation funds, but it's actually, because we know standards have been raised, you know, we're actually calling it a renewal, but it might actually qualify as, oh, sorry, we're calling it a level of service improvement, but it's actually, I suppose, more tied to that investment for depreciation. Like, do you know, have you taken that into account in any of your analysis, or I don't know whether or not that's a valid argument, that we know that some of our level of service investment is a reasonable proxy for the renewals.
So Campbell, I can probably take that. So with the information that we received on the capital programme, the Waters team have already categorised it. And they have done all the splits. So even if you had a project that was predominantly level of service and had a small factor of renewals, that has come through in that, yeah. So that has all been, Campbell wouldn't have, it just kind of came through in the data, so we kind of know, and that's what's been put through into the finances, so that would have been captured.
So it's an accurate reflection then, of the fact, of our depreciation. Okay. And the second point that I just wanted to raise is about the delivery risk for our capital program.
It's like Campbell's got some company on the Queen Street.
My experience around the council table is that often capital expenditure timing changes, not because of the ability of staff or contractors to actually do the work, but it's more developer timing. You know, developers might be saying, oh, I thought I was going to need this completed, you know, by the end of 2024, but now we're pushing it out for another 6 months. You know, there's quite a bit of that in our budget changes. So is that taken into account when you are sort of giving us a score for the delivery risk and our ability to sort of complete our capital works program?
So the way that we've assessed it, so we have looked at what you've historically, planned to spend against actuals. And so the water service delivery plan does not drop into much detail on it. It just kind of asks how you're sitting, which is why we have done a bit more of assessment around that resource and capacity. So historically, your delivery rate is around about 85%, 84.6, 85%, which is super, super high in relation to the rest of the councils across the country. In fact, you're probably on the same profile as Watercare actually, so you're quite unusually high in regard to your planned delivery. So that signals to me that yes, there's definitely changes, there's those third-party influences that you don't have control on, but overall the water services team are managing that extremely well. So to walk away with, you know, a nearly 5% actuals against planned is quite up there. It's quite impressive actually. So, and you've got your processes in place. So I would imagine that I can't see any reason why that would deteriorate that way.
Great. If there's no other questions, we can move on to the next slide. So the net surplus slide, yeah.
We're now, we're net surplus, Campbell, and we're also pretty impressed with your ability to change locations.
The week tour of downtown Auckland. So net surplus. So this is then looking at that next component of financial sustainability, which is looking at your revenue sufficiency. And this is looking at whether your projected revenue is sufficient to cover the costs of water services delivery. The metrics that's being used here is this net surplus. So that's calculated as your operating revenues, less operating expenditure, interest and depreciation as well as included in that. So you can see on the graph there that your operating costs, which are the bars, have been increasing over the last 6 years. They've gone from around 26 million up to 42 million. And over the next, over the forecast period out to FY34, they're estimated to go up to around 72 million, sorry, per annum. So that's around a 5% increase over the next 10 years. And those costs are being driven by higher depreciation. So that's coming off the back of your asset revaluations as well as your investment levels. your higher interest costs, reflecting the increased debt that you have related to Three Waters and higher interest rates. And then there's also higher maintenance, the energy, labour and material costs as well. So you've got this increasing cost base underpinning it, but you can also see there that that top line, which is your operating revenue, that's also growing, and there's a sort of material increase over the next couple of years. So your operating deficit that you've had, so that there's that dark red line, the bottom line, it's been in deficit for the last couple of years. Before that, there was a deficit and a surplus. It kind of moved around, but over the forecast period, it moves above the zero axis, and you're in positive for the forecast period. And so that's tying back to those revenue increases over the next couple of years. Maintaining that level of surplus, though, potentially raises the question of whether your revenues are higher than they need to be to cover your operating expenditure. But obviously, you'll see as we come through the rest of the story, there's this need to have higher revenues to support your higher levels of debt. And exactly coming to that point that we discussed earlier as well around capital revenues not being included in that analysis.
Campbell, I've just got a question here from Monty.
Campbell, just on this revenue sufficiency question, I've always understood that in a regulated market, the regulator allows you to receive a return on capital and a return of capital. And I'm kind of not seeing that here. This is kind of that old way of thinking that operating expenditure, operating revenue is covering operating expenditure. What do you think going forward? Are we going to be, is the ComCom going to kind of impose a normal regulated price, or is this going to be odd, like, you know, more like what we're analysing here?
No, essentially with the regulated world, you come back to cost recovery, and one of those costs is a return on your capital. So typically these are privately held assets, so that private capital needs a return on their capital as well that they put into the business. And then but what we do have already shown here is the return of capital, which is your depreciation. The nuance there is definitely going to be around what's the appropriate level of depreciation, what's the appropriate time period to recover that cost over. And on the recovery, or sorry, return on assets, because you can't pay a distribution, you don't have private owners that take your dividends out of the business, everything's reinvested, local government's a cost recovery model, you don't have that component built into it other than your repayment of debt, which is your interest component here. So elements of it are already picked up. It's just a question of how that changes when an economic regulator looks at it in terms of how you recover those costs over time, i.e. depreciation, and also if there's any allowance above those costs to ensure that there's a sufficient level of investment into your assets.
So just to add to what Campbell said, that's the kind of, because these aren't going to be profit-making organisations, that's the kind of detail we're expecting to see both in Bill 3 in terms of the more detail on the design of the CCO arrangements themselves, but also more importantly in the economic regulatory regime that will come. So it's a good question, but we don't yet know the answer, although it is likely that it's that because they're not profit-making businesses, you can't compare it to the way that the ComCom has approached things like airports, which I know is a model you're familiar with here because you own shares in one.
And definitely how they incentivize investment through that return on capital as well is something that will need to be looked at.
Yeah.
The final point is on the slide as well, just on the right-hand side there, you'll see that there is a net deficit on the residual council position. And although that may be alarming at first, it's essentially primarily a function of your transport activity, which, as you know, receives funding from Whakatahi or NZTA. And as a result, it means that you don't need to have as much revenue in that activity because that's partially funded by Whakatahi. So said in another way, that activity doesn't fully recover depreciation because it's partially funded elsewhere. So just be aware there. Cool. If we can move on to the net debt to revenue. So this section is looking at financial sufficiency. So this is whether the council can raise the borrowing required to finance investment while maintaining within your financial limits. There has been a material increase in borrowing related to Three Waters over the last 6 years. It's gone up from around kind of 10 million up to 150-ish million dollars. So it's quite a large increase over a short period of time. And you can see there that borrowing is at an elevated level. And so on the left-hand side, that dark red line is the line for Three Waters in total. We've also shown how that varies across each of the activities. So the grey, almost vertical line is your stormwater. You've got your wastewater as the higher dotted line, and then the lower dotted line is your water activity. So there's a bit of variation between each of the activities. But the level that we're focusing on is around the Three Waters level, so the dark red line. Your repayment of borrowings is relatively aggressive over the next 10 years. And that is a function of a lot of that debt relates to growth investment. And as those development contributions come in, your repayment of debt is material. And you've also got those large operating surpluses that are also used to pay down debt as well. And so while it starts relatively limited headroom, as you increase over time, you develop more headroom in those activities. On the right-hand side, what we've illustrated is that comparison of water activities. So again, the dark red line, council, which is the middle line, and the bottom line, which is council excluding Three Waters. And this is a really common picture that we see across the country with councils where water activities are much higher, more highly leveraged than other activities, reflecting that high investment or infrastructure nature of them. And the long-term lives of those assets, that's appropriate to have higher levels of debt so that you can spread the costs of that infrastructure over time. But what it does mean is that when you, with your other activities, they need to have a lower level of leverage so that you can stay within your rating agency and LGFA covenants that you have to meet. And this is where that challenge comes in around the best way to hold these assets and to manage them alongside other activities. So following on from that, in terms of debt headroom, essentially is the inverse of that picture. So when you're above those thresholds imposed internally and externally by the likes of LGFA and rating agencies, it gives you an information around how much headroom you have, how much borrowing capacity. And because your borrowing is done at a council level, so as a council as a whole, the headroom that's relevant to you is what does your council have in terms of headroom? And you can see on that previous slide that you are sitting at around that level that's in line with LGFA at the moment. But looking at Three Waters on the standalone basis, this left-hand graph is showing that there's currently you're above those internal and external limits. This is definitely going to be an area where potentially you can look to LGFA to increase those limits. So if you could push up towards the 500% that's been indicated, that will give you headroom from around FY27 in terms of those metrics for water on a standalone basis. But there are some requirements in terms of setting up your water activities and being able to meet other kind of prudential limits. And then on the right-hand side, when you remove the water activities, your residual council has quite a significant amount of headroom there in terms of funding your activities. If there's any questions, we can move on.
I think we just move on, Campbell. Or yeah, just move on, please.
So as we talked to a little bit before, there's the water utility specific metrics. So this is what rating agencies look to for when they're looking at water utilities as opposed to councils. So when they look at councils, they look at their debt to revenue ratio. When they look at water utilities, and typically a lot of other corporates, the rating agencies will look at the funds from operations to debt ratio as the primary metric. And we're expecting LGFA would look to this metric as well when they're assessing the water utilities on a standalone basis. essentially reflecting that debt profile where debt's gone up quite significantly over the past few years. It's at an elevated level at the moment, and then it gets repaid over this few years. You end up with this kind of U shape on funds from operations and the kind of N shape on the debt to EBITDA metrics. They're essentially inverted measures of each other. But where you're at the moment in terms of around that kind of low double digits is consistent with a number of other water utilities internationally. And even the ones that have access to private capital are typically down in the high single digits. So where you're at the moment is not an unusual place to be for a water utility. It's just when you look at it on a council lens at a debt to revenue metric, it is that sort of alarming picture of you're up near 500%. But internationally, that is consistent with the water utilities. The other component that we have here is how development contributions are treated. So the funds from operations metric looks at your EBITDA, less interest, less tax. And so it picks up those development contributions revenue as well. There's always just going to be that question of what does your forward profile look like? How likely is it to be delivered? And what's the risk there? So potentially a haircut might be applied to a forecast there that's overly ambitious. So then on affordability, so this is the final component, and this is looking at how your water rates on a per connection basis, including GST, compare, and this is including your essentially out of your targeted and general rates across all customers. So it is at a high level as opposed to down at your individual ratepayer types or customer types where you can do a bit more granular analysis. But with that increase over the next couple of years in revenues related to water activities, you can see that the average charge per connection is going up from just under $2,000 or a bit lower to up over $3,000 per connection. So it is a material increase over the next couple of years. I think the increase is around 29% in FY26 and 21% in FY27 at their revenue level. So there's a bit of growth in that and a bit of price in that as well.
Campbell,
But you are.
Campbell, I've got a question from Steph here.
So it's might be a question of detail, Campbell, because I see that you've used the affordability benchmark there, so that makes sense, right, that we're keeping within that. But at the moment, I think our median income is something like 121 or 122,000. Do we know what by 2034, what that projected income will be? Just as a,
just
question of interest. Do we know what that is?
It's going from around 120 up to 160 by FY34.
Okay. It's always helped from a relativity perspective. Otherwise, you tend to think in current terms. So thank you. That's helpful.
So that's about a 3% increase per annum.
Yeah. Thank you.
And as you noted there as well, though, that you are still under that affordability benchmark.
Yeah.
And that's based on some international thresholds. And I think that a specific number is a reference out of the United States.
Thank you.
But other utilities, and I think Watercare targets under 1.5%. So it's always going to be a bit of variation, a bit of subjectivity in how that assesses. And it's sort of, I think the key question is definitely for your ratepayers is going to be that increase over the next couple of years, which is relatively material. But this isn't the whole picture, right? So you are looking at your rates overall, they aren't increasing at 30% because you have other activities that have a smaller increase in charges that offsets this larger increase in water. So essentially you have a reallocation of revenue into your water activities over the next couple of years. But customers aren't incurring a 30% increase on their rates. It's lower than that. Cool. So yeah, as has been discussed.
There again, Mike Pitt has a question.
Yeah, thanks, Susan. I'm not sure what page you've got there, but page 32 for us, just about this rate increase over time. So there's a statement in this document here on page 32 of ours. Revenues revenues for Three Waters services are projected to increase in the draft LTP by 165% over the 10 years, from 34.4 million to 91.3 million. This represents a real increase of 6.3% per annum above the projected rate of inflation and projected population growth of 2.7%. So just so I've got it right, so we've got inflation plus 6.3% above that is so around 9%. Is that sort of going to be the average sort of water rate increase?
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, so inflation's around 4%, so it's around 10% overall per annum.
10%, yeah.
But very front-ended.
Yep, thank you.
And so yeah, just basically just to reflect back through what we just talked through, the 10-year plan appears to be partially consistent with their financial sustainability requirement under local water done well. So you've got a couple of components to look through there, though. Investment sufficiency, as we've talked to, it's in line with the depreciation expense, which is a key metric from the TIA will be looking, or the government will be looking at. Revenue, we've raised that point around whether there's that material surplus, but there's obviously a reason for it. And that's supporting into your financing, which is around higher levels of debt at this stage, but it comes down quite quickly over the later end of the forecast period. And then as we talk to affordability as well, around how that looks for your ratepayers over the next couple of years, and then throughout to the end of FY34.
Thanks, Campbell. So that, I mean, is it a comforting picture? Well, not really, not for your community with those kinds of rate increases. But the key is, as I said to you, you are a bit burdened with choices because you could do it yourselves, but the question is, should you, given the strategic pressures that you've got and given the benefits that greater scale could offer in terms of the cost pressures that you are going to face into the future. Those benefits of scale shouldn't be overstated, but they do exist and they need to be well understood. So that's the next chapter of our time with you this morning, is to now look at that current financial position and look forward to what that means for your options. If everyone's comfortable, we will move on. Campbell's still going to be able to be alongside us to answer specific questions on the potential financing implications or the way that credit rating agencies or the LGFA may or may not view, which he will do in a qualified way, given those rules are still becoming clear. But if you are comfortable, Susan, we'll move on. Great. So part of our work for you was to look at, there are some ordinary things that we would expect every council to want in terms of strategic objectives for their communities. And then there are some things that are specific to individual communities. So in these strategic objectives here and how we have assessed them for you, we have some things that are ordinary. So all councils want financially sustainable water services of a high quality that protect the public and the environment. Some councils have a different view on workforce, and you have a bit of a balanced perspective that you want the right workforce and capability to be available. An example of where a council might take a different position is if they were a council with that is very remote, where capacity and capability, particularly if they also moonlight as civil defence, response and things like that. So you have it's important, but it's actually relatively neutral when it comes to determining your future choices. Your exceptional point, your point of difference is growth. And we've coupled it here with system resilience because it really is about, I don't want to borrow a term that's being used, it's about future-proofing. Although, is it about future-proof? It's really about looking towards those growth pressures that you're facing and making sure you're well positioned. We know from what Campbell's already told us that you're almost running your assets now like a utility, which is good. You're well positioned. But it's really about going forward, how you're going to anticipate that growth. And there are some legitimate questions that were raised earlier by councillors around the relationship between spatial planning, your, strategic aspirations for your community and the level of water services that those communities will demand of you. Affordability is universal, and I've already outlined to you that you do face some particular responsibilities to your hapu and iwi in your area that are relatively novel compared to other countries, other communities, because of your natural resources treaty settlement that you have. The other thing that is a bit particular, although all councils care about it, it's the remaining council operations are viable if you are to look at options that take water services out of your council proper delivery. The only reason I draw your attention to it is because you have spent some time talking about the anchor institution framework and the importance of that for your communities. So that's why we've paid particular attention to that. So those are the strategic objectives that we distilled from reviewing all of your strategy documents and interviewing your staff and interviewing some members of council. And I would hope that there's nothing extraordinary in those and that there's comfort and we can move on unless you tell me otherwise. So then this is a slide of an infinite font. And I'm glad it was in the pack for you. This sort of sets out the high level options that we have considered on your behalf and kind of the content of those, the critical questions that we think you should be asking yourselves. So we have looked at the option of an internal business unit, a standalone CCO, a growth council option. So that's a sub-regional CCO, most likely with those councils that are also experiencing rapid levels of growth. We have identified yourselves Waikato District and Hamilton here, but obviously there are other councils in your broader area that are also facing growth. There is the Waikato Water Done Well option that you are considering later, and that is in 2 phases, the stage 1 and the stage 2 phases. So those are the options that we analysed in detail for you against your objectives. And while we have quite a detailed traffic light analysis in the pack, I thought it's probably most useful to use this simple slide, which is a summary. And again, reinforcing under this local water done well, the choice is obviously yours. And so we're using the choose this option if construct, which I think is a helpful one. So an internal business unit or division of your existing council function is not something that we would think that puts you in a strong position given those investment requirements that are likely to be driven by growth. And it would require you to be very confident that you would be able to get current investment requirements and future investment requirements away, and you would need to be confident that those strategic risks are unlikely to be realised. So that's so we actually don't think this is a particularly viable option for you. The CCO option on a standalone basis is an option that could be available to you, and while feasible, it would likely require kind of a rephasing of some of your investment activity, and it doesn't provide the scale benefits that working on waters with other council areas might offer. But, you know, you're lucky to have this option because it gives you a really reasonable backstop. So that's why we've categorised this one as a maybe. Option 3 is the high growth council combination. And this is an option that really aligns your interests with your spatial planning interests. And that is by looking at a combination with Hamilton, yourselves, and Waikato District. And if your main concern is around managing those long-term spatially planning-led growth pressures, then this is a more attractive option. It has strong future benefits to align with those growth challenges, but would require careful transition management, in particular, given that some of those councils have particular challenges that are not shared by you. In Hamilton's case, those are predominantly related to the rollout of metering in their community, and in Waikato's case, they have some very large revenue increases that they're going to need to secure from their community to meet the cost of their infrastructure, and they also have limited capability. Option 4 is an option that we don't think that you should pursue. That is a stage 1 of the Waikato Water Done Well model, which is a model largely around scale services rather than combining the asset link balance sheet capacity. So what that option is good if you have plenty of debt headroom and no internal capability. You have the opposite. You have good internal capability and limited or not growth sufficient balance sheet capability. So this is not a particularly good option for you. And under the Waikato Water Done Well option, you would not want other councils to stay in stage 1 for long, if at all. And then your other really viable option is the Waikato Water Done Well stage 2 option, which, as you know, excludes Hamilton. But that option means that you would have to be confident that those smaller councils, you would be a large and well-managed council in that construct. You would need to be confident that others would move to phase 2 quickly. And the extent of the benefits when it comes to scale will really depend on who else participates. So now that was a very quick trot through some quite complex options. And I will be guided by you largely, Ms. Susan, about how you would like to take questions on those, or whether you want me to delve into the more detailed traffic light assessment.
Let's just take some questions first. Andrew.
Yeah, right. So that all seemed quite clear, I think. My question is, how practical would it be to action option 2, but with a view to moving to, well, 3 or 5 as quickly as other councils, you know, we're reaching the point to make a sensible decision. Did I say that wrong?
That's an excellent question. And each time you have a halfway house or a period of sustained uncertainty, it has a cost. And it's quite hard to quantify that transition cost. That's why we call it your backstop option. It's one that is viable for you to consult your community on, but is kind of what will happen if you can't get agreement in some of the other options that will offer you that scale benefit and that increased financial capacity that is attractive through time. So is it practical to do it? Yes, theoretically. Should you be comforted by that? No, not really, because the longer the transition, the more uncertainty for staff, the more uncertain, the more this continues and, you know, as a debate that occupies your time and energy. So it's a comfort to have it as a backstop position, but it's not something that I would like to pause on for long in terms of getting those longer term benefits. Your staff might also have a view on that particular point.
Sorry, I'm just also having a conversation with me, Susan, about some running concurrent discussions. I guess at this point, what I would say is that, and I think, Andrew, you'll be aware that if the world is not the same as we know it, Scotty, going forward, and I'm getting my head around the implications of what a standalone CCO means for council and the complexities of running with that nexus of 3 regulators, taking, if we got our crystal ball out and said, right, there's other CCOs around us. So as to Sarah and Lorraine's points about, it's not only what we're doing, but what are our neighbours doing? How does our context change as much as as for our own business context, but the context around us? So, and that might have staffing implications. It might have implications for access to civil contractors. It might, I mean, the Manhattan skyline of development across the Waikato, what's the number, Carl or Dawn, for the whole of the Waikato for the next 10 years is something like 5 billion. It's huge. And so if you think that there's a limited pool of people to deliver that, everyone's going to be competing for that pool, right? So how do you want to be best placed to compete in that pool? So we have to think about the complexities for our own business, and it's not our current environment, just replicated into a slightly different organisational framework. It's not that the world changes and then the world around us changes. So understanding that for our business, and then what does that mean for the rest of council? Our focus, our funding and finance, our ability to deliver, all of those complexities. And hence I understand for you why this is the decision of our time. But they would be the things that I would say are on my mind, Andrew.
So, yeah, I certainly accept all of that as being a sensible approach way to look at it. And look, I'm not advocating for option 2 as being the best option at all. It's just that we've sat on our hands and done nothing for 10 years. And I guess the local water's done well. The legislation is kind of ensuring that some kind of action is going to happen. So that's a bit of a comfort. And I guess, if you take that as being so, then we should probably be looking at whether we choose 3 or 5 as what we pursue.
Did you want to respond to that?
Oh, yeah, I mean, I was, as I said, I think that option is best characterised as one that you can take comfort from, but not sit in for long.
And the water services plan, the consultation is going to require us, as you said, doesn't it, to go out and to demonstrate to the community that at least we've considered options. We don't necessarily have to lay out the detail of multiple options in the community. The legislation doesn't require us to do that, but at least we can demonstrate we have considered with substance options.
Mike, and then Monty, then Claire.
Thanks, Susan. What's your gut feel of option 3 and 5? Because one of the things here is there's going to be a lot of borrowing with these CCOs, and there's mention here about, I guess, credit rating risk. So before I sort of would flip-flop between one and the other, it might be for Campbell, I'm not sure, but how do we gauge what is going to be, we're going to get the best interest rate here? Because this is longitudinal borrowing.
Yeah, I will get Campbell to respond to that particular issue. I think the judgment here is around the balance sheet capacity of the different combinations of options under 3 and 5, and you don't have that information. I understand Waikato Water Done Well is now in that process of analysing the financial implications. The judgment will be which councils are in and what assumptions are made around that and the timing of that work. If you are attracted to pursuing option 3, then you need to get on to looking at those issues quick smart. The benefit is those councils are already doing it in parallel, and so when it does actually coming to drawing together a financial picture, then you get people like Campbell to draw those financial capacities together. Scale really matters when it comes to the managing long-term investment choices. As I said, everyone thinks that this is a reform for their neighbour, but actually everyone will have a different major investment requirement sometime over the next 30 years. And the transitions, the price transitions and the revenue transitions are not fast. We're talking about 5 to 10 years of running kind of that transition period. And that's really common in all sorts of utility businesses that come together. So you don't need to transform overnight. You can run quite separate systems and also expectations of investment and revenue through time as you kind of unbundle to rebundle it together in a more efficient structure. But you do have to keep the asset on those benefits. You do have to make sure that any CCO that you create knows what you expect and delivers them. You'll have the economic regulator helping you along to make sure that service levels improve. But you, as I say, every day that you kind of delay just increases the transition cost. But Campbell, do you want to speak in any detail to the issue of sort of balance sheet capacity and which combination may or may not be more attractive based on your knowledge?
Yeah, and I think there's probably just a couple of different facets to it. One is I'd split it into access to capital and cost of borrowing as two separate points. So, and then on the other side, it's the council rating and the water entity rating is two different points as well. So on the access to borrowing and cost of borrowing, you have access to LGFA at the moment. You have a high council rating through Fitch, which means that you have really good access to capital at the moment and at a low cost. However, you are up against thresholds that are imposed by LGFA, which potentially will limit you over the short term to be able to borrow but access more. Then looking at the water entity, if you can establish that on a standalone basis, you'd expect it to come out of your rating with Fitch. So the way that Fitch look at credit ratings for councils, they exclude self-supporting entities. So you'll be able to look to potentially exclude that water activity if it's on a fully self-supporting basis, but that would just be something to work through. But then the question is obviously what is the access to capital that water entity has and at what cost? So the closer, if there's potentially support required from council, which is what LGFA is signaling. So if you want to borrow, if that water entity wants to borrow through LGFA, they've signaled that they would need to have a guarantee from council, which potentially challenges that self-supporting component. But it also means that you have links back into council, but access to LGFA. So you then have benefits of that entity being able to access capital and potentially get it at a competitive rate, depending on how LGFA pass that on to the water entity. And then that entity would potentially also have access to external capital markets as well, both through banks and depending on the scale of the entity, if it got large enough, potentially into capital markets, so domestic and international bonds as well. But again, that also starts to offer different products, so you can start to look to longer term capital that can align the repayment of those borrowings with the life of the asset, which is more appropriate given the consumption of those assets over a longer period of time.
Just on that point, Campbell, though, sorry, Mike again. So if council effectively has to guarantor, that would still go, well, councils would still have to go towards any debt ceiling.
And again, it just depends on how, so potentially LGFA will look at the two entities separately. So you would have your council's residual council, and then you would have the water entity assessed separately.
So Steph was just going to go to that point. Then I have Monty, Claire, and then you, Roger.
I guess I just want to reiterate something that Sarah said earlier, but to your point, Mike, just to reiterate that the Waikato Water's Done Well work is obviously still working in terms of what that looks like for them. But we are having really open and ongoing conversations with the future-proof councils as well. So how does that map through is, those conversations are still live. And some of this is still obviously emerging as our LTP budgets land as well for ourselves and our figures land. So I just, to your point, just saying that a lot of work still to go, but firmly under consideration what that looks like.
Monty.
Look, my question's gone, thanks. Adequately answered.
Perfect. Claire.
Yeah, thanks. My focus is also on debt ceilings or capacity and the cost of borrowing it. Yeah, it was a really good point that Mike Pettit made, whether or not, because council has to guarantee the CCO, does that actually affect our debt ceiling as well? Because, it's sort of a debt we're responsible for. So I feel that there's been an assumption made that under option 3, those growth councils, if we join with them, that there'd actually be more debt capacity. And I'd like to test that. I did take the opportunity to read the Hamilton City Council paper on their option assessment, and it looks like they don't have any debt ceiling, okay, even for 10 years. So if we think that we're going to join with them so that we get more of a debt ceiling, we might be disappointed. It'd be really good to understand that. Secondly, I do agree that we have to be really understand ourselves our strategic aspirations or priorities before we start negotiating. At the Zone 2 meeting that I went to on Friday, with the DIA rep from the Waters team, he made it very clear that this is going to be a negotiation. They're happy to help us with that. Okay. And he said, don't expect your love cycle to stay all rosy. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Could be rocky. That's why I'm really keen for us to be very clear on what our strategic priorities are before we get into sort of more detailed discussions. Yeah, thanks, Steph. It's just that some of the things that I feel we do need to understand in more depth haven't been covered today. So, I mean, maybe we do have a chance to have a more open conversation about what those priorities might be. Yeah, I just feel that this has been excellent as a framework, definitely. Yeah, but it triggers to me that we need to do some more in-depth work.
Yeah, thanks, Claire. Then I've got Roger online. Sorry, Roger, can I just, Sarah wanted to answer that, and then Roger, then it's your turn.
I'll be brief, Mayor, because I do have an eye on the clock. It is a very well made point. I did make that point too, is that you actually need to understand the financial implications of both option 3 and option 5. I don't think there's any bias or assumption that you would have more financial capacity. They're both unknown. What there is a bias towards is the links between your growth orientation and the spatial planning pressures at your boundaries under option 3 versus, to a degree, you can tell me whether there's more community of interest alignment under option 5. Either way, you don't yet have the financial analysis. And in order to do that, you would actually need to have a conversation with those councils and you would need to get access to their books. A lot of them are public, but you'd need to do that together. So I agree with your substantive point, maybe would provide you advice on your process point that in order to properly understand the financial implications of option 3 and option 5, you'd need to talk to them. Thank you.
Yeah, point well made. Roger.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Mayor Susan. Yeah, certainly I can see Steph's point in the maybe option of 2, and that's kind of pushed that a little bit further into the background for me and leaving out now the options to be 3 and 5. My question was, and I think that Steph did refer to it a little bit there, but we're beginning to understand option 5 a little bit more with the heads of agreement work that's gone on and the fact that we've been able to at least read through that, even though there's no commitment from all of those councils to go forward with that. But I was wondering, we get conflicting messages coming out from Hamilton in terms of what they're wanting to do with their water services. And again, Steph, you mentioned that there's substantial talks going on with our future-proof partners. And I'd need to know more about that to have a better understanding of what the implications of 3 are for us. So we're not kind of getting the same level of feed of information on 3 as we're getting on the feed of information on 5.
Yeah, Councillor Roger, I apologise if I've led you astray there. There isn't the depth of work that has gone into 3 than there has been into 5. 5 has been substantial work programme for weeks, but the conversation's alive and we are just bringing on some extra capacity into our team to be able to navigate this, because the workload involved in this analysis, you've got Becca and Martin Jenkins in front of us, we've still got to have some weight in our team and bandwidth. So we're bringing in some extra resource to be able to analyse the options and to help strategically with the information to you, to exactly your point about what you're needing, to Claire's point about what she'd like to do. So apologise if I'd sort of given the impression that they're both at equal stages, but I wanted to reiterate that Hamilton and Waikato are being nothing but open and inclusive. That's really important for you as councillors to understand, including an email we just got yesterday back from those teams in a conversation we've been having with them. So I just want to reiterate that.
Yeah. But it's possible that could no longer be an option. it's possible.
At this stage, that option is still on the table, Councillor Roger. Yeah.
Right, okay.
My reading of the Hamilton City Council consideration of it by paper, obviously I haven't, we've had conversations with their team, but not to the degree Steph and her team have, is that they are very attracted to an option of a Waipa relationship. And their ambition, their long-term ambition remains a Waikato-wide CCO. It's the path that gets to get there that is the difference.
And I think that would be fair to say for all councils, Sarah, that ultimately everybody sees us coming together. It's the pathway there. And to reiterate Sarah's point as well, Roger, the future-proof element, this joined-up strategic alignment alongside all of the work we've done for 20 years around future-proof and being the growth hub, but with a sort of the halo effect beyond that is really important for us to consider. So it's something we need to really give due accord to in our deliberations as Waipa for sure. And the fact that we still haven't really got a hold of what does that growth look like in Northern Waipa, Southern Hamilton, or as the Mayor likes to call it. And so that, you know, again, that comes to the fore, is that what is that going to look like and what is that going to mean going forward?
Yeah, I mean, future-proof as a partnership that we've done so much work in strategic and spatial planning seems a logical combination to go with waters as well. So you're linking in with the same sphere of interest.
Mayor, I am mindful of time.
Yes, there you go.
I have included this slide about specific implications of a CCO option, mainly because I even think today the Mayor of Auckland, Mayor Brown, has opinions on CCOs and how they can be managed and tamed. And I think he's announcing something today. It's important to know that the CCO or the water entity proposals are quite different from, and they will be set out in legislation, and there will be an economic regulator. So while establishment of CCO does give rise to particular risks, they're not the same risks, or there'll be different risks, and they will be provided for in terms of the legislation. So don't compare apples with oranges in that regard, is probably just some counsel from me. And therefore, getting to the substance of our combined analysis on behalf of colleagues from Becker and Maffick, you're in a good position. That doesn't make it an easy choice. It's a well-known economic theory, the paradox of choice. Sometimes it makes the decision harder. But you have done a lot of work here and your assets are in good nick and you've got a good team advising you, and that's something that you should be proud of for your community. There is therefore a balance of effort that needs to go on between now and when you undertake your community consultation around those joint options. Of course, I wouldn't be involved in strategy work if I didn't say keep your options open as long as you can to get the best deal for your community, but that comes at a price, and that's the price of your staff commitment and time, and really whether you think the two options in parallel, advancing those, makes sense or not. Or you can make a strategic choice now and to really identify whether option 3 or option 5 best meets your strategic interest, and ask your team to really progress more detailed work, particularly their financial analysis, because when it comes to putting the deal together and the pathway forward for you, you will want to make sure that you have good adequate recognition of the work that has been done, and that there is sufficient provision for the investment demands that will come for your community. So you need to go into that discussion. I would urge you not to view it in a short-term transactional frame. Like I said, everyone thinks this is a reform for their neighbours. Actually, it's also a reform for your communities long-term. So don't be transactional about how you approach it. Think about those longer-term decisions. But that is that's the conclusion of our analysis and recommendation for you. It gives you kind of 3 broad choices. I had hoped we'd get you to 2, but I do think that you've got some good, credible, viable options on the table.
Good, thank you.
Any last questions for these two? Look, really, I mean, it's an excellent piece of work. It's sort of laid it really clear for the non-financially minded individual, it makes abundant sense around where some of the fish hooks are and where some of the possible opportunities are. So, yeah, thank you very much for that. Any last questions for these good people before we let them get on their merry way? No? And I believe lunch is here. It's a good time to put a full stop at the end of the sentence, and thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you all. Go and
I'll
have lunch,
mine-
Roger.
I'll have mine delivered. Thank you.
Thank you. And thanks for watching, everybody. And thank you, Campbell Online.